Welcome back to Cove Street Boatworks. It is pouring out. Hopefully not too much of this is getting into the sound. But today, episode 7, we're going to talk about wooden boat building, glues and epoxies, a dysfunctional relationship. So let's start out with defining the difference between restorations and repairs. Restorations are an effort to return an object to as close to its original condition and functionality as reasonably possible. A repair, strictly to extend an object's immediate serviceability. These two are often in conflict with one another. The whole approach of putting sister frames in, for me, is always a repair consideration and never a restoration consideration. It's something that you do because you need to address some imminent issue with the hull and you just don't have time to pull it into the shop and strip the interior out of it and reframe it. So sister frames are something that, puts additional holes in the planks, and it's something that from a restoration point of view, you're going away from the original condition and not toward it. So it's a repair consideration. Very different objectives. To accomplish either one of these, repairs or restoration, inevitably, it's going to require some kind of glue. Glues used in wooden boat building and restoration include epoxies, Resorcinal phenol formaldehyde, or RF or Resorcinal, Urea formaldehyde, or plastic resin glue, and polyvinyl acetate like Titebond and Weldwood. We talked about polyurethane adhesives in previous episodes, or we looked at 3M5200 and Sikaflex, so we won't cover those in this episode. Each one of these glues has its own advantages and disadvantages, and each has situations where they may be best suited. Epoxies have a wide variety of use in wooden boat repair, but very targeted use in traditional constructed wooden boat restoration. This is a very controversial and emotional discussion for many, so let's start with the easy glue types. Don't forget, no matter what kind of glue you're using, take the time to pull down the safety data sheet and understand what impacts, if any, using that product might have on your health and your environment. Act responsibly, be informed, and make educated decisions. Let's start out with Resorcinal phenol formaldehyde, commonly known as Resorcinal, because who wants to say all those words? This is a structural adhesive classified for exterior use. It is very tough. You can boil this for hours and not impact the integrity of the glue line. But there are two aspects of this adhesive that have kept it firmly in the professional domain. First, it doesn't have any gap-filling capabilities, certainly compared to epoxy, where we can mix a variety of fillers into it to create its own kind of characteristic. Amateurs can use Resorcinal, but they have to make proper, well-fit joints that have good contact. This requires a lot of discipline and is often an area in wooden boat repair or restoration that amateurs just aren't all that skilled in, and they don't like to spend time on it. It also requires firm and even clamping pressure to develop full strength, and also there are environmental conditions that are optimized for the maximum strength you can achieve with Resorcinal. Certainly humidity and heat have to be very, very consistent. A lot of the big shops in Maine actually went as far as to install steam heating systems in their shops so that they could provide the proper ambient conditions for Resorcinal to cure to full strength. Resorcinal is excellent for laminating white oak rudders, keels, or anything else along that heavy, heavy material. Tropical hardwoods it works well with as well. Another disadvantage for Resorcinal might be the dark reddish brown color. Splashes in glue oozing from a joint can be cleaned up with water, but a dark glue line will remain when cured. Secondly, there's Urea formaldehyde, or plastic resin glue. I used to use this all the time. It's very easy to use. It doesn't require the same level of joint quality that Resorcinal does. It's a little more gap filling, although again, not like epoxy. But it must be moderately strongly clamped. It's very strong and sands very well after setting. The glue sets hard with zero creep tendencies, just like epoxy and Resorcinal. It minimizes the springback when used for bent laminations, but it is not entirely waterproof. It is water resistant. And this can be a problem for many applications. I used it for years on mahogany runabout transom bows where we were laminating white oak. And it worked really well, and a lot of the original manufacturers used the same product there. But over time, you would see the glue lines get powdery and lose strength and delaminate. So epoxies were obviously the way to go in those areas, but for a long time, for cost reasons and for other reasons, for ease of use, we always had a tub of it around. I think it's getting a little harder to get now in this country. Certainly the early formulations had a lot more free release of formaldehyde than the later formulations. They seem to be much, much better. Depending on the temperature, clamping duration is usually around 6 hours. The last glue type we're going to talk about before we get to epoxy are polyvinyl acetates, or PVAs. PVAs, as you probably know them, Titebond and Wellwood, they're a one-part emulsion that uses water as the solvent to keep it liquefied. When the water is absorbed and evaporates, it leaves PVA to harden and cure. Waterproof PVA like Titebond 3 cures in this fashion, but has additional chemical reaction to provide a waterproof quality. They are great for non-structural interior and exterior tasks with porous materials, especially wood. They are inexpensive and water resistant or waterproof and are perfect for general woodworking and interior boat construction. They require moderate clamping pressures. The drawbacks with PVA is that they tack up very, very quickly and they can lose considerable strength if left open too long. Large or complicated areas requiring lots of time for adhesive application are better left to things like epoxy that have a long open time, or even plastic resin that we just looked at. They can be reactivated, and this was an interesting thing to play with. If you have a veneer and you're trying to veneer some surface, you can paint it with PVA on both sides, thin coats, and let it skim up. And then put it together and then use an iron with some steam to reactivate the PVA and make that bond. And it works surprisingly well for veneers that you want to bond to something like furniture veneers where it's not going to be exposed to external conditions. PVA does have a little bit of an elastic quality, so there will be some creep, and that's one of the downfalls from it. But that can be either a positive or negative depending on where it's used. Toxicity, believe it or not, it has low toxicity, as you might imagine, but polyvinyl acetate by itself is a carcinogen if inhaled. So everything out there has some kind of tax on it. All right, we've worked our way down to epoxy. Epoxy is a glue supplied in two parts, a resin and a hardener. They're mixed usually using a manufactured supplied metering pump, or they can be mixed by volume, and that's usually how we do it here. There are many, many different formulations that address specific uses and environmental conditions. Epoxy is an immensely strong exterior and waterproof glue with just a few sensitivities. It has to be correctly mixed or it may not set at all. It requires UV protection and it must be heat protected. It doesn't do well with being exposed to extreme heat. One of epoxy's strengths is the gap filling capability when microfibers or other fillers are added to the mix. Mixed to that thickened state, the glue is then perfect for overcoming all sorts of bad amateur joinery. The use of fillers does alter the glue strength characteristics. It weakens it. Epoxy requires a light to moderate clamping pressure. Joints clamped too tightly may result in failure due to glue-starved joints. And you'll see there's very little glue in these joints whatsoever. They are clean. And I literally squeezed it out because the shape of the lamination was, required fairly significant clamping pressure. So unprotected continued exposure to uncured epoxy can stimulate allergies. And this is very, very common. When we first started working with epoxies back in the 1980s and early 90s, we really didn't understand that repeated exposure to green uncured epoxy would cause these kinds of problems, and it would be cumulative over time. Initially, you might not start out with any kind of adverse reaction, such as rashes or itching or welts. I've seen a lot of different manifestations of having allergies toward epoxies. I think maybe more modern formulations have gotten slightly better, but still it's something to consider. It's usually exposure to the hardener, which is certainly more sensitizing than the resin is, and to uncured green epoxy, like when you're sanding. These are usually the big issues. So whenever you're dealing with any kind of epoxy, wear an N95 mask and gloves. And if you're sanding green epoxy, a Tyvek suit or some kind of complete coverage, long sleeve shirts and gloves and long pants should be worn when sanding or even applying epoxy. As a rule, traditional wooden boat construction methods are not well suited for epoxy. I'm going to get a lot of hate mail about this, but it is true. More modern wooden boat construction practices like plywood construction and laminated construction techniques, they employ composite materials and they greatly benefit from epoxy's characteristics. Epoxies can be the bane of wooden boat restoration practices when misapplied. Once the boat is built, you can't fully encapsulate the separate pieces, which is what makes epoxy encapsulation so effective in preventing rot. If you can't encapsulate the part, the epoxy is nothing more than an expensive coating that provides the opportunity for trapping moisture in the wood with limited avenues for its escape, therefore actually introducing the potential for rot. In short, traditional constructed hulls retain their market value and serviceability when maintained with traditional methods. My strongest advice to any potential customer when searching for a project is, number one, best case, try to find a totally original, unrestored boat that is complete, even if it's in tired or rough condition, especially a boat with some documented history, something worth restoring. Number two best case, the average case. Find a hull that underwent traditional restoration and has been well maintained, even if the restoration wasn't top notch. If it was done using traditional methods, we can reverse it, we can restore it. Something worth maintaining and using. And number three, the worst case, find a hull that is in use that has had a modern hybrid restoration. Epoxy impregnated, encapsulated hulls, hard glued bottoms, epoxy spline seams, cold molded veneers applied to the outside of the hull. These are all big, big red flags. Buy it for 50% or less of the market value of a well-maintained traditional example and use the hell out of it. When you've squeezed every use out of it you can, we'll completely tear it down and rebuild it right. Buy it cheap enough so that we can afford to tear it down and start all over again. I'm sure I'm going to get a lot of hate mail from that, but I've had a lot of terrible experiences with epoxy. So that is the conclusion of episode 7. I hope you've enjoyed it. Please like, subscribe, and leave me some comments. I'm working on doing some videos this weekend on some actual work in here on the Fan Bowen and on the S-Boat. So look for that next week, hopefully. Thank you very much, and I hope you come back.